And then Dr. Daniel Siegel, who I think is a genius, but has never been in the map conscious state. In a way, I guess I would like to integrate and link. I respect everything he's created, but I would like to create a differentiation and linkage to include other perspectives of so-called bipolar and schizophrenia as just mental illnesses. When I feel like we have gone beyond even what he has created in his research, and then when we come back, it's like a burnt out light bulb. We've sort of fried our circuits, but and he said that knowing of consciousness may come when the energy position is in this plane of possibility. So I feel like he's saying awareness is in possibility. Well, that's what happens in map consciousness. We are very aware of possibility and that so much is possible. It's a shift from thought to possibility. And then he said, in the plane of possibility, you reach down into infinity, time disappears. And it's a state that's basically the same for all of us, which is like oneness. And really, with what he's saying, he could have a label of a mental illness. Yet, because he's a researcher, he can get away with it. But if somebody else came and said those things and said, I actually experienced that, then they'd likely just get a label of a mental illness. So I just find it very contradictory to say certain things intellectually, yet people who are saying it experientially are getting labeled. And it makes sense that if somebody goes into that state where time disappears, it feels infinite, there's possibilities, there's synchronicity, the brain is going to change. And maybe it changes to such an extent that when it comes back down from that state, it's disintegrated. It's like putting 100 watts through a 50-watt bulb. And he talks about practicing states to become traits. And I think I talked about that before, and it's the same with mania. One can practice the manic state, even if they're not in that state, for those gestures to become traits. And then when it's actually tied into the neurology of the body and the brain, then one can handle that energy when it comes back again. And he mentioned how Einstein said that the self is an optical delusion of consciousness. Well, that's definitely so. But I've been to the place where it's not an optical delusion, that the self is an optical delusion. It's experienced that there is no self. And actually, I think that when a person goes there, their brain totally changes. And then when they come back from that state, when their brain sort of loses the energy and isn't able to maintain that state anymore because it's not practiced, it's something new, then when one comes back, one doesn't really speak the language in the way that it's spoken here. And then they sound odd. And then because they're not talking properly, they are diagnosed with something. And then he said, other people are us. The planet is an extension of our body. Now that all sounds very psychotic to me. Yet I know what he's saying is true, because I've felt it. I feel like if he was to take a group of people labeled with bipolar and say all these fascinating statements, people would say, yeah, so it's true. Yet nobody will listen to the supposed crazy people when they say stuff like that. I think crazy people could come up with a lot of interesting stuff that wouldn't take 20 years of research. Because when we're in that state of oneness, we are the researcher. We can just see it with our own eyes. So really, people who go into those altered states and get labeled are actually researchers of the mind. The mind sent us to that other dimension to see it and experience it and feel it and bring that information back and those insights back. But those insights are called symptoms, or how we feel when we're being reacclimated to this linear and logical reality that we supposedly live in here. We are supposed to be helping them because they exist in the level of thought, and we went into the mind and intelligence. But we keep quiet because that's the compassionate thing to do. And he said, be an integrator, find chaos and rigidity. And there's a lot of that to find in the mental health system. So maybe I'm a mental health integrator. And he mentioned that we're telling kids a lethal lie, that the self is a separate thing. And yet the same kids who bought that lie, who somehow 15 or 20 or 25 years later see that it was a lie and go into the no self state, are pulled back to themselves by society and the mental health system. So there's those of us who do see through the lie, but then we're given another lie that we're mentally ill for seeing it. And he mentioned an example of right and left brain not being integrated, and he said, why not give people an opportunity to see they're living with half a brain? And I feel like people who go into map consciousness can help other people see that they're not living with their whole brain and their intelligence and their wakefulness activated. We're not living with our full potential of our brain. Never mind this half brain, left, right, and all these other ways to integrate the brain. I feel like the mind can integrate the brain in a second. It can push the brain into that other world. And I feel like mania is a journey into being more integrated. We go along this path that the mind pushes us along, and we become more and more not the me. And when we become not me and we have no protection of the me, we rely on other people and the world. When that happens, relying on people and the world with the world as it is, one can't last in that state, so one does get collapsed back into an ego. The protection goes back up, and when it does, it's really scary. It feels like death. It feels like dying from that innocence of not having this me self to having that reinstalled painfully. So look outward, have insight, and be born into the real world. And I wonder if we can strengthen the manic circuits, the manic sense areas of the brain. I feel like that functionality is something beyond anything that has been really defined. And it's probably undefinable. And as soon as one tries to define it, it's gone. Because the one that tries to define something is defined, and how can the defined define the undefinable? It's impossible. And I've been thinking about science and how the gold standard is really to repeat an experiment and have it verified by other people. And we're so obsessed with repetition and memory and proving and stuff, when if we drop that, what is there? There's an ever-changing flux and flow of perception, and when it's clear and not muddied by this second guessing and wanting repetition and proof of something that can never be repeated, then there's just living. I feel like we all have our brain trained in terms of science, like we have this objective observation, and that we can repeat things. But by thinking that way, it makes it seem like there is objective observation and that things can be repeated. So we're actually confirming that by setting up science that way, when if we didn't think that way, maybe it wouldn't be true. Or what I'm trying to say in a way is that we're so muddied up with so many things that we think we need to verify and repeat things for it to be true. But if we were truly clear and one and connected with intelligence, we would see it with our own eyes. We wouldn't have to look elsewhere for verification of something. We would live in possibilities. We would live as energy and possibility, not wanting to confirm stuff. For what? We're more obsessed with repetition than just rhythm. When we can see rhythm and relationship, then we flow with it. We don't mechanically repeat stuff. We've turned ourselves into robots of thought, and we're trying to break out of that. The mind is trying to break us out of that. We're in this invisible cage of sounds reverberating through our nervous system and controlling us. And we think that because we can sort of steer a little bit with thought, that we're living. And somebody asked a question about, he had 9 levels of integration, and the last one was kindness. And they said, if you just do kindness, won't it sort of integrate all those lower levels? Something towards that effect. And he said yes. And I was thinking about how in mania we're very altruistic and kind. And I think the traits of mania integrate the brain in so many ways without having to practice. It becomes part of daily life. And daily life integrates the brain through the gestures and all those things that I've talked about. Thinking there's a me there that's going to be integrating stuff is counterproductive, because above all that, there's the no self state. So why reinforce this me thing? There could be some value, but I think it's just limited. And I think actually the real integration is with a lot of the manic traits of wanting to dance and sing and being spontaneous without trying. It's just how one is. One's celebrating like we did as children. And that's the really integrated state. That's not mechanical. It's living. The integration is trying to break down the mechanicalness. So being playful, and the manic traits I think would integrate beyond. And he mentioned the word neuroperception, so I made up a word, map perception, which is MAP, map perception, which is mind action potential or mind action possibilities. The mind has a certain action potential. It potentiates certain actions and gestures and playfulness that is something way beyond practice. There's no one there to practice, it just is, it's just your state. And in Ken Wilber terms, it would be about making that state a stage. And that's why embodying one's mania is important. Again, our brains aren't integrating because it integrated into something else. All of those structures in the brain that integrate memory or integrate this or integrate that, they're all structures of the me. They're all structures of a scarred human being. Kids aren't born with those all filled up with memories and junk. And when one is in mania, one doesn't need that information. And so it just blows apart. And then we come back from that state and we're not allowed to talk about it. We'd love to talk about all of our experiences if we weren't being looked at with the pathological lens. And the only way for a brain that is disintegrated from returning from map consciousness to integrate is unconditional love and not judgment, because unconditional love and oneness is what the brain is now attuned to. So people, regular consciousness people, can show that and be that. Then it allows the brain that safety to share what it needs to share in order to have dialogue with regular consciousness people, in order to allow them to see that other world, that all their years of science is a very slow process compared to what would happen if people just listen to people who've gone there. And listening to people who have gone there is not rocket science. It just takes listening and care and attention.